Welcome to YourTown. My name is Kierstyn Berlin. We're in the Carmel Design Center. I have Theo Maehr here with me, continuing our design series. And we just closed up with Rob Carver talking about architecture and fireproof homes. And Theo, you and I have known each other for about 5 years now.
5 or 6 years.
A little more than 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think it's a fun story how I met you walking through Carmel Valley Athletic Club door and Carrie Bernardi looking at you and looking at me and saying, you two need to know each other. And we were introduced in the doorway at CVAC, and I came to find out just in those passings at the club that you had built a Vashtu home yourself off the grid in Big Sur. And there was a couple trigger words there for me that really got me excited. And I said, Theo, I need to come see your home like now. And so we scheduled it, and you gave me a tour of your home. You are the first person I've ever met on the Monterey Peninsula that has lived off the water system with no well on rain catch water for the last,
13 years.
13 years through the droughts. And just a little context to that, I have been having that conversation with a lot of people for many years and was always consistently told it was impossible to do in the Monterey Peninsula. We didn't have the right climate for it. So and then also, obviously I'm interested in architecture and design, and most architects that I meet don't know what Vashtu architecture is. So as a holistic designer, as somebody focused on those elements, I was so excited to know that that was something you were familiar with, and not only that you were familiar with, but you had actually built your home a lot from reclaimed materials as well. You built it actually yourself. And there's just so many things that I know people meet you around the community, and you're this eccentric personality, and you have so many gifts and so many skill sets, and you have so much experience. I don't feel like people know the depth of the quality of your knowledge and what you can contribute to this community. And I am just so excited to share you with the community today, because I think you are such a gift to this community. So,
thank you, Kierstyn.
Welcome. So the first thing I want to talk about is your home and how you built it and why, and also in the context of the fire. And then I want to hear a little bit about your experience with the fires that happened in 2016 that you were so very much immersed in physically in so many ways.
So when I think back to first stepping on the land that I eventually bought, I was looking for a place where I could be close to the wilds and have that vibrant natural influence in my life, where wildlife was coming onto the property. And
do you mind just giving us a little background about your education? And
I feel like I had a very unusual upbringing and education. I've been raised on large tracts of land, agricultural land, close to wildlands. So it's always been a part of my surroundings. And there was a great desire in my life to be as close as I could to wild creatures. So from an early age, I spent a lot of time in the outdoors, watching birds and hunting up tracks and trying to get close to mammals. And my family was very supportive of it, and I had a brother that was a wildlife biologist, and that just was part of my life through all the years that I have been alive.
And that was your greatest education.
That was the greatest education, was being in the outdoors. Yes, very true.
And your formal education?
My formal education, I ended up, by some chance, going to a boarding school in New Hampshire, St. Paul's School, which set me up to be able to get into Stanford. And I went to Stanford for a couple of years and then stopped out for 20. And did all the things that I felt like were actually very important, like learning to grow my own food, learning to build, work with my hands and my body, and to really try to find harmony with the planet that I was living on. And eventually, I was inspired to go back and ended up finishing with 2 degrees from Stanford in 2001. A bachelor's in geologic and environmental science, and then a master's in education. Because there seems to be, and we're getting into a whole other topic, but there seems to be a great lack of contact with the natural world in our educational system. And we can see the effects on the planet, certainly. A great kind of disconnect from many of the things that we need to be doing. When I got onto my land, one, I was just awestruck by the beauty of the landscape. It's 4 miles away from the coast, and so there's a beautiful view of the ocean. And there was, at that point in time, a beautiful madrone forest with mixed black oak and bay laurel. South side was chaparral, manzanita, chamise. Beautiful piece of land, and the land was on a saddle on a ridge top. I bought the land and knew that the biggest challenge I would have being on that land was the threat of fire. So from the very beginning, I had that in mind, and I located my house on the ridge, a little ways away from the south slope where the most brush was, and on the edge of, and a little bit within the madrone forest. The canopy of the madrone forest was high, so I didn't feel there was a big threat of fire coming through and burning the house. If it got into the forest, it would be in the canopy. So I oriented my building by using fireproof materials. I stuccoed the outside, did a metal roof. The one drawback, I think, from my design is I have a lot of windows, which don't hold up well in heat. The biggest thing that I did in my whole construction was to build a room that I use as a cold room for storage, but it's also a fire shelter. And it gives me the opportunity to stay on my land if there's a fire. I
can talk about the construction of that, because I know what it is, but...
Well, it's a, cement slab, concrete block walls, and then a cement roof, and it's buried.
And you use it for food storage?
I use it for food storage, and I have some wood slabs that are slowly drying out in there. And I also store my scuba tanks in there. So
very convenient.
If there is a fire, I have an air source. And in fact, during the Sobrani's fire, which was started, I believe it was July 22nd, 2016, I spent a week up there defending my structures and probably 5 or 6 acre piece of my property that I had orchards and gardens, and I didn't want all of that to burn. So I spent a week from the day the fire started until I felt things were safe, staying on my property.
So can we hear that story a little bit more in depth? Because it's kind of it's an interesting story how it all unfolded, because you weren't supposed to be on that ridge when the fires came through, and everybody else had come down as instructed. And you were, by some fated reason, up there with the flu.
I was. And on Friday, the day the fire started, I woke up with a fever of 102 degrees. I had a meeting with somebody from the septic company in our area. So I had that meeting because it was very important for the whole permitting process for my property. And as we were finishing, I was already down near the fire station. We were called out. I was on Mid-Coast Fire Brigade at that point in time. and we were called out for a brush fire at Sobrani's. And so all I had to do was walk up the driveway. I got into my gear and I went on that call with Andreas Baer and Norm Cotton. We showed up on scene and it was clear there was smoke coming from a spot where it would have been very pleasurable to camp. And I said, as we were sitting there in the truck, I was certain it was from an illegal campfire and illegal campers. And as we were sitting there, we were about, I don't know, 150 feet away from CAL FIRE officials and state park officials and highway patrol, and sheriffs had all accumulated there. And we watched as 3 backpackers came out from the canyon, and no one did anything to stop them, which I just thought, how can this possibly be? There was the obvious people. We were sent away. CAL FIRE had let us know that they had it handled, and we even offered to take them up on a ridge that would put them above the fire in case they didn't have it handled. And the 3 of us looked at each other and we all felt quite certain that they actually didn't have it handled. But we went home, and I spent most of Friday at home kind of watching the smoke, hearing helicopters and airplanes, and realizing the fire was headed straight for Palo Colorado Canyon.
Which is where you live, just to clarify.
Yes, yeah. Which is where I live. And I'm up on Long Ridge. I'm at about 2,700 feet. So I have a pretty good view. I had a good view. I could watch the smoke column as it progressed. Saturday, I finally was able to rally enough to sweep roofs off of leaves and debris, start pushing things away from my buildings that were combustible. And by Saturday in the evening, the fire had come in through Rocky Creek and had come up the north side of Long Ridge. And about 8 in the evening, I drove down in my 4Runner with a shovel, and I got out and I walked over to where the fire was now progressing toward the east across my property, and I went up and started working with the fire. And it was more like working with the fire. I felt like I was greeting it rather than being fearful of it. And there was about, I don't know, 150-yard stretch of fire line that was progressing across my property. And I just began to work it where I could, where the fire was small, 8 to 12 to 14 inches high. I just began to create a line of bare mineral soil and throw the dirt onto the fire where it was progressing. And over the course of the night, I put the fire out, amazingly enough, over 150 yards or so of fire line. I just kept working where I could. If the fire was too intense and big, I would walk away from it and then come back and work it when it had gotten small. Mm-hmm. And by the time it started to get light, I was just absolutely amazed that I had survived the night, and here the fire was out. Earlier in the afternoon, that Saturday afternoon, neighbor after neighbor I had watched go down the hill. It was mandatory evacuation. I actually had 2 neighbors stop in, and they were like, "Theo, you've got to come off the hill." And I was like, "No, I'm not going off." And they were like, "You've got to." And I said, "Look, I've got the fire shelter. I'm going to be okay." And it was that fire shelter that really actually gave me the confidence to stay up and do what I needed to do.
And you really utilized it with the oxygen. I mean, that was really
was
necessary.
Air. Compressed air. Yeah. I didn't actually use it until Wednesday, which the fire had wrapped around and come around from the south at that point, and the smoke was just enveloping the property. Mm-hmm. And my son and I actually spent about 2 hours resting in there while we could. So yes, I utilized it, and it was when you opened up one of those scuba tanks and let fresh air into the room, it not only cooled the room,
Right.
because as the air decompressed, it created ice on the outside of the tank, but it was fresh air. It
Right.
was like being in heaven.
Right. And we're certainly not trying to condone people not evacuating their homes, just expressing that, that's not necessarily what I'm interested in. But this conversation with Mark that we've been having is how does design impact people's lives, or why does design matter in really meaningful ways, right? And so the way that you thought about, you came into that property having a very clear understanding of the ecosystems, how things burn, a heightened awareness of the plants, their properties, and obviously being on the fire brigade, had an understanding of how to approach fire
Yes.
in an appropriate and safe way. You also had stored water because you were living off of the water system, had a lot of stored water, which I think actually was utilized by Cal Fire to help out when they did get up there eventually, because you were by yourself defending that fire in those early stages.
Yeah, Sunday morning, our fire chief for Midcoast, Cheryl Getz, and her husband Jake came up and were amazed, one, that I was still alive, and were amazed, that the fire was basically out. They sent up 3 people from our fire brigade, Aaron, Carrie, Wakar, Kadim, and one other person came up, and we went through the neighborhood, took care of things. Turns out Cal Fire had started a fire below me without ever asking if there were houses up above, which is what then roared through my Madrone and Oak Forest. And fortunately, at the same time this was all happening, Cheryl had arranged for Cal Fire to come up to defend the ridge. So as this wall of fire came up from the north, started by Cal Fire, and the 2 groups of Cal Fire firefighters were not in communication around this whole thing. Okay. But as the fire came up, at the same time, 2 captains from Cal Fire came up and they discussed what to do, and behind them were 3 engines and 2 hand crews.
Everything on that ridge behind you was saved. It was one of the few areas that didn't just roll over and destroy everything.
It was.
The most homes we never lost locally, as far as I could tell from a local fire.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people's homes, and a lot of people that we know personally, and
I know, it changed the
homes
community
that I
completely.
grew up in, literally spent most of my childhood in, were lost in that fire. We're going to take a break in this segment, and we'll be back to continue talking about land stewardship.